All right, so we're going to talk about the colonial period. This is stuff that you looked up on Friday, but we are going to go into more depth with it. All right, so a colony. In the 16 and 1700s, English established colonies in the America. We found that a colony is a group of people in one place who are ruled by a parent country elsewhere. So the English were ruling from over in England, which is, of course, across the ocean. Early colonists remained loyal subjects of England, with a strong sense of English political tradition. So they weren't planning on coming over here and starting a whole new country in the beginning. They just kind of wanted to come over here for reasons that we're going to talk about later. They accepted common law, and we talked about common law earlier, and we said that that is law that wasn't necessarily written down, but came to have the same force that a written law would. And as time went on, it also began to include the rulings from judges and courts. They believed that the ruler was not above the law, which we learned was called rule of law, and expected to have a voice in government and other basic rights. So they came over here. They still were loyal to England, but they also thought that they were going to have more of a say so in how things were run. Jamestown. All right, so this is the first permanent English settlement in North America. It's located in Virginia. It was founded in 1607 by the Virginia Company, and it was organized as a joint stock company. This provided investors partial ownership and a share in future profits. So as you can see, it was set up as a business essentially. Merchants received something called a charter from King James I, and a charter is a written document granting land and the authority to set up colonial governments. So the king was granting land because, when they came over here, they saw this big, huge chunk of land, um, for what they saw as unused, even though the Native Americans had been living here. But in their mind, it didn't matter. It was kind of free land, free materials. So the kings began to give away charters, for them to come over and create a new colony. There is a representation of what Jamestown would have looked like. So as you can tell, it's not very big because they were having to, build houses by hand. At first, Jamestown was managed by a governor and a council appointed by the Virginia Company. So remember, those are the people that were setting up the colony. In 1619, the colonists formed something called the House of Burgesses. This is extremely important, because it was the first representative assembly. So if you remember when we were talking about democracy on day 2 of the class, there were two types. The ones that they kind of set up was the representative assembly, meaning that they elected people, to the House of Burgesses to then vote on different and separate issues. The House in reality had little power, but it is so important because it marked the beginning of self government in colonial America. So that term self government is really important, because while they were being controlled from England, this kind of little council essentially was set up in hopes that they were going to be able to have more of a say so in how things were run. And plus, back then, you didn't have telephones. So they needed people that were kind of more up to date and able to make decisions quickly, like right there on site. Next, we have the Mayflower Compact. So in 1620, another group came over from England, and they built a settlement called Plymouth, in what is today now Massachusetts. Even before the Mayflower, so that's of course the ship that they came over on, reached America, the colonists, the people on the boat, realized that they needed rules to govern. They wanted to survive in a new land. So they realized that, hey, if we want to be successful, we need to go ahead and set up some kind of structure, so that it's not pure chaos when we get there. Because of that, they drew up a written plan for government called the Mayflower Compact, of course, because it was written on the Mayflower. So this established a tradition of direct democracy. So if you remember, direct democracy then is where each person, gets a say so firsthand. So, where in a representative democracy, you have people that are voted to make the decisions. Here, each colonist, each of their voices mattered. They got a direct vote. Throughout the colonial period, citizens held town meetings to address local problems and issues. Those town meetings then developed into town government, and anybody in town could attend, but only men who had been granted land could vote. And of course, those who, had been granted land were the wealthier guys. These town meetings, they are still held today across America. They're referred to as, town halls, You hear a lot of times that politicians are holding these. It's kind of a political stunt, but to make it look like they are listening to the local people. Now it's a little bit different than it was back then. All right, so here we're going to compare the first two colonies. So in Jamestown, you had the representative democracy, which the body was called House of Burgesses. The 22 members were then elected by the colonists directly. And then you had Plymouth. So colonists on the Mayflower signed the Mayflower Compact, which set up the direct democracy, and members would come together and vote on the direction that the colony would take in those town meetings. So by 1733, you have all of the 13 colonies set up. They stretched from Massachusetts, which back then included Maine, so the top of the country, in the north, to Georgia in the south, because of course Florida was settled by the Spanish. So each colony set up its own government. Each one had a governor, whether it was either elected by the people living in the colony or granted or appointed, I should say, by the English king. It just kind of depended on how the charter was set up. They had a legislature, so representatives elected by free adult males. And by free adult males, they also mean like males who had land. As years passed, colonial governments took on more responsibility. Colonists grew used to making their own decisions about America. And we're going to talk about that term in a second, about what that's called. So here you go. So the big thing to remember about the early colonial governments is that they had 3 branches, just like we did today. That's going to come up. I know for a fact that there's a question on your Unit 1 test about this. And I'm pretty sure that they put stuff like this on the final also. So when we're talking about the 13 colonies, we're talking about this strip of red right here. So right on the East Coast. All right. So now we're going to talk about, why did colonists immigrate? Why did they take the chance of leaving their cushy life in England to sail over on a boat and start a brand new government over here? So many were religious dissenters. Basically, dissenters means that they followed a different religion than what was the official religion of England. So the Anglican religion. They were persecuted religious. There wasn't really religious freedom. So many founders of Massachusetts were Puritans. They consider themselves pilgrims. So this is where, when we talk about the pilgrims, this is usually who we're kind of thinking about. Others sought religious freedom. So you had Quakers in Pennsylvania, Catholics in Maryland, and then Connecticut, Rhode Island. So when we're talking about why do colonists immigrate, the phrase that is the easiest to remember is gold, glory, and God, right? So this piece, God, represents the people wanting religious freedom. And then here's just a quick kind of rundown on the specific colonies itself and why they were set up. All right. The next reason, economic opportunities. So this is the gold part. Economic opportunities, especially in the South. So when they discovered this new land, they said, oh, wait a minute, here's a whole new kind of land that has all these raw materials that haven't been used. Now, were they being used by the Native Americans? Yes. But of course, these colonists didn't care. They saw them as free materials and ways to make a profit. Early Virginians struggled until they successfully raised and sold tobacco. So in Carolina, in the beginning, there was one Carolina. So it contained North and South before it split into 2. You had indentured servants, which were colonists in America that agreed to, colonists in America agreed to pay the cost of transporting servants to the colonies, as well as pay for their food, clothing, and shelter until their labor contracts basically expired. Mercantilism. This is an important concept. It was an economic policy that said a country should sell more than it buys, and that's just kind of common sense, right? So you want to export, meaning you want to sell more than you import, more than you buy. When I pay my bills each month, I need to make sure that my bills are less than my paycheck. Because if my paycheck is $2,200 a month and my bills are $2,500 a month, I'm in the red. And then the biggest term is called salutary neglect. So England will allow colonies to rule themselves in exchange for raw materials. And this is kind of what ends up biting England in the rear end, is the colonists get used to governing themselves.